In the first part of this journey, we started out in a normal-looking Doom house and then stumbled our way through various realities to reach its Brutalist incarnation. But if you can believe it, we took a shortcut, and there's another way we can reach here that involves skipping through more realities. The cosmic network of the multiverse is getting denser now, so I've put this flowchart together in the vague hope that it might be helpful. At this point, we've rewound to being trapped in the altered version of the house with no exterior doors to speak of, and we've covered 3 routes out of it. The 4th route out of here is actually going to be 2 routes, but to be able to visit both of them you have to do one before the other. So let's examine the mirror world. Observant players might already have noticed something strange about the mirror in the small bathroom on the upper floor. The mirror doesn't accurately reflect the room. If you get in the way of the door swinging closed, you'll see the door on the other side of the mirror is still able to shut, and if you stand in the right place you can see a zombie man in the kitchen that isn't there when you look behind you. This is because this mirror is not a mirror line but is in fact another portal line looking into a different part of the map. The doors move in sync because of a clever use of a property called mirror polyobject number, which is set on both doors. The polyobject on the mirror side is numbered 30 and the one on the other is numbered 2, and they're each set up to refer to the other. More usually, this property is used to tell one half of a double door to move at the same time as its counterpart when the player interacts with one of them, but it turns out there's nothing at all that says doors paired like this have to be adjacent to each other. When we were exploring the altered house earlier and went up to the newly grown attic, we saw that the blue skull key had no reflection by using a line tagged 1943 and uncovering the full-length mirror. When we did this, it ran script 70, which is called Mirror Exposed, and it did quite a few things. In order of convenience to explain, they are: first, remove the special action on all the lines tagged 1943 around the mirror so that the player can't activate this script again. The opposite of that, set lines tagged 1689 to run script 69 when they're activated. By spending 6 lines changing the appearance of some sector floors and lines, the tumbler on the bathroom sink in the mirror will appear to move to the shelf behind it, giving the player another hint that the places on either side of the mirror are not the same. The last thing is that the script lowers the floors of sectors tagged 3, 4, 5. Most obviously this includes the sectors that make up the cover over the mirror, but it also lowers a sector acting as a barrier over the bathroom mirror. Normally this sector is invisible to the player because of the use of a transfer heights line on the sector surrounding it. This tells GZDoom to always render it as if its floor were at the same level as the surrounding sector. At least I think it does. I don't fully understand how this line action works. A sector right behind the mirror is also lowered so that the player now has room to move into the space beyond it. Having this space is a requirement for a player being able to move through a portal line in GZDoom, as you can't count as walking over a portal line unless the player's centre has room to go over it. So with the barrier down and the space opened up, the player can lever themselves onto the sink via the toilet and walk straight through the mirror to find themselves in a blue-tinted reversed version of the house. This also matches one of the nightmares that was described in the WAD author's journal. As the player passes into this reality, the distorted Run in 3 music will play again as the player crosses lines tagged 1689 that were set up to do this when the mirror was uncovered. This surprisingly disorienting mirror house operates in the same way as most of the other house variants we've seen before, with its own population of monsters to kill and items to pick up. The Doom monsters here are actually custom monsters, extending the existing ones with the sprite flip property set, making the former humans left-handed, and the sound effects for the enemies and doors are unsettlingly reversed. The mirrors here are all visual portals that look back at the non-mirrored house, but the player can only pass through the one in the small bathroom. Unlike most of the other transitions we've been through so far, this one isn't one way and the player can return to the altered house at any time. Before they retreat though, the player can pick up a wine bottle from the kitchen, a baby's milk bottle with a desperately sad pickup message from a crib stored in the attic, and the blue bauble that was visible through the mirror that we saw before. A second set of picture frames in the living room makes up the 8 other slots for a total of 16 special items, and the same sector lowering technique is used to bring the items into view as they're picked up. The wine appears in one of the mirrored house frames when taken, and the other 2 items are recorded in the frames in the altered house. A detail that particularly stands out about the mirrored house is that the outer doors are intact even if they've disappeared from the right way round house. Provided they picked up the blue skull, this means the player can open the garden gate and escape to the second level. Slavrid knew. Slavrid New continues the mirror theme. It's a map under the lump named 20 Pam, which is a reversed underhalls with the same ghostly blue glow as the mirrored house and a set of reversed textures and monsters. You'll also notice that the music is playing backwards, and it's an actual MIDI that's had its notes moved from one end to the other, not just a capture of the original audio that's been turned around. Like Underhalls, completing this level will allow the player to carry any collected weapons and ammunition back to My House. This time the player will appear in the mirrored house from the start, using a UDMF feature usually reserved for handling hub maps that allows for multiple player start points. Reversed MIDI continues on the intermission screen and the mirrored My House until the player passes through the mirror again. If the player starts in the mirror world, the key cards are unavailable because the player can't get to the first house, so the plasma gun in the Brutalist house can't be picked up, but there are no special items that are impossible to reach, and the game can still be completed. The whole loop through the mirrored underhalls is just an extra that gives the player the opportunity to collect some weaponry. They only really have to get the milk bottle, which runs script 6, in order to move to the next part of this route. After taking the bottle and returning through the mirror, they'll see a plastic ball has appeared on the floor, just one of several that has been spawned by the script at various map spots throughout the house. Out in the hallway, the player can follow the trail of balls leading down to the office, which has remained conspicuously sane and Euclidean so far in the game. This time, when opening the door to the cupboard, they'll find the floor has split apart to reveal some sort of chute poking through it. This whole time, the floor here has really been a 3D floor that was lowered away below the bottom of the sector when the milk bottle was picked up. Jumping down will make the player hit the real floor of the sector, and an actor hits floor object will teleport them to yet another area. Yes, we're doing the haunted daycare thing. This is another place mentioned by the author in his Journal of Nightmares, and looks like the lower floor of the house with a coat of paint to transform it into a childcare centre. The player will emerge in a ball pit which they'll have to struggle through, fighting against Boom's friction sector effect. On the wall to their left is an inexpert drawing of Shrek. Not the scariest version of him I've ever seen, but that's only because I grew up with Aberdeenshire's own clearly possessed playpark storybook Glen. By moving hastily away from the mural, the player will find that a baby gate blocks their way upstairs, but they still have access to the other basement rooms. The furnace room, which is now a rundown kitchen, has nothing consequential in it, but it's interesting that it has irregular sectors set up in it that look like perhaps the floor was at one point meant to become cracked, or there could have been a spill of whatever kind of rancid soup is on the stove. Crossing this line into the corridor will replace the floor of the office back in the altered house, preventing the player from descending the slide again. The cupboard opposite the kitchen has a berserk pack high on a shelf where the player can't reach it. If they go around through the room that was an office and into the toilet adjacent to it, they can punch a cracked wall to get it down. This is done by script 40, which simply removes the berserk pack on the shelf and spawns a new one on the floor. There's also a baseball in the playroom, which is the first special item for this area. On pickup, it says it's autographed by J.J. Hardy, who Wikipedia tells me plays for Milwaukee, Minnesota and Baltimore between 2005 and 2017. There's a classroom in the far bedroom with a coloured mat, alphabet mural and an uncanny drawing on the blackboard. If the player opens up the double doors into the cupboard, they'll find a pink clown costume hanging up there, which frankly is putting it on a bit thick. In the corner, a box of crayons is the second special item. After the crayons have been picked up, the player can go back to the main room to find that Shrek has disappeared. Once again, this was done by a script that lowered the ceiling of a sector too thin for the player to notice to conceal the texture. Curiously, the script also removes a single red ball with the tag 1292 from beside the ball pit, and this action is unnoticeable because there is an identical untagged red ball in exactly the same position. When you come back into the main room with the crayons in hand and cross this line, yet another sector ceiling moves to reveal a new door in the classroom. This door leads through another line portal to reveal a rundown outdoor area that resembles a graveyard more than a playground. After struggling through the overgrowth, you'll find the third special item from this area of the house waiting on the swings. It's a soft toy that looks a lot like Sootie's friend Sweep, and which gives you the comforting message Snugs when you pick it up. You will now have to defeat Shrek. As much as I respect and fear most of this map and the oppressive atmosphere it creates, I find this part absolutely hilarious. Shrek is placed in the near corner of the playground/cemetery behind a tree and will have been pursuing you since you came in. Despite his class being called Childhood Nightmare, he isn't a threatening enemy. He's slow and his only means of attack is to wallop you when he's close up, so it's very easy to just keep moving away from him. Especially if you've gone to the underhalls and brought back the super shotgun, you'll get through his 1000 health points fairly quickly, and before too long he'll burst into a shower of rocks and will leave behind the gate key. Picking this up will allow you to open the park's gate and get to the door beyond it, which will return you to the basement of the altered house. We should just be thankful that the author didn't grow up with Mr. Blobby on children's television. Now that we're back in the altered house again, we're going to turn our attention to the bath. There's a rubber duck floating in the water that we need as our 12th artifact if we count the ones that we know we'll pick up later in the Brutalist house. To reach it, we have to press use on the 6 sinks in the house. One in the kitchen, one in the laundry room, one downstairs in the weird bar room, and one in each of the 3 bathrooms. Each of them runs a script that will raise a watery 3D floor to give the impression of the sink filling up, raise another one to incrementally raise the level of water in the bath, and slightly lower an invisible barrier across the bath that works like the one across the bathroom mirror before. Once the bath is full, the invisible barrier will be fully lowered, and the player can step into it to retrieve the duck, which will say chugga chugga horse horse when picked up for reasons that are beyond the scope of this video. They'll also find that they can sink down into the bathwater, which goes slightly deeper than the average American bath, but not in a way that's unwelcome. When they touch the bottom, an actor hits floor object in this sector will quietly teleport them to yet another house copy, and they'll only detect the change once they come to the surface again. We're now in the flooded house, so named because there's a ton of water spilling out of the bath and sinks. The water is added using swimmable 3D floors, which slow the player's movement down. Unlike other versions of the house, this one contains no enemies or important items. It's really a pass-through to a bigger and stranger area. The player's explorations will take them downstairs under the waterfall coming off the balcony, where many doors will be obstructed by floating boxes. As they approach the bedroom at the end of the corridor, this line will silently teleport them to another half copy of the flooded basement, where the route back will lead them to be caught in a set of square corridors connected with even more line portals. As they loop around, the walls will gradually become covered in tiles, and they'll eventually emerge in an oddly tranquil, steamy environment that resembles a bathhouse. Before you get too comfortable in here, you'll have to deal with a couple of nightmares, which are stealthy wisp monsters that can pop up in front of your face. But after those have gone, you're free to wander around what little of this variant of the house there is. Again, there's no basement, and the substance of the environment seems to break down into a blue sky void in several places. The place where the basement would be is a one-way line portal that forms another entrance to the bathhouse, which the player can use by trying to return upstairs after entering the flooded house basement. Whichever way you got here, your escape route is through the changing room, which is yet another confusing set of non-Euclidean passageways that move the player silently around with line portals. To avoid getting caught in a loop back to where you started, you have to follow the corridor to the right past the lockers. You'll eventually find the diving and swimming pool, which is occupied by some sort of gigantic hellfish that will shoot lightning bolts at you and nibble on your limbs when you get in. The fish can be killed, but I prefer not to, because once it's died it will explosively spew a multitude of its horror babies out into the water, and they're much harder to shoot. At the bottom of the pool is a 20-sided die. This is the first of 2 special items in this evolution of what for the sake of simplicity we'll still call the house. Once it's collected, the player can sink down into a tunnel where one of the black lane marking tiles should be. The tunnel takes the player through a very long winding stretch underwater, and it's very difficult to navigate it without taking drowning damage. Along the way, you'll notice a couple of drains above you leading outside. The first drain will give you room to breathe before continuing, but in a move typical of this WAD's toying with the player, the second one will not and is only there to waste your rapidly diminishing oxygen. Eventually, you'll emerge in a fragment of a building overlooking a set of platforms floating in an expansive blue sky. This can be a challenging section because the wights on the distant platforms throw homing missiles that don't have many walls to detonate on, and you'll be ambushed halfway along the platforms by a swarm of another custom enemy, the Hemodemons. It's slightly less easy to fall off than it appears because there's a long narrow invisible platform underneath the fragmented pathway. It's a 3D floor with its opacity set to 0. This floor also extends from one darker tile in the middle of the pathway to another to the player's right, giving them a route to one of the floating islands. Here they'll find a wedding ring on the pedestal, the second of the special items in the bathhouse. By retracing our steps and then heading into the floating portal, we'll finally meet up with our original route at the Brutalist house, and we can collect the 3 further items here as I described several days ago. By going the long way round, we're now up to 14 artifacts. The way out of the Brutalist house involves falling down 2 holes which will teleport the player elsewhere, once again by using actor hits floor objects with a silent teleport action that brings them to the top of a different hole elsewhere. Eventually they'll find themselves in yet another square concrete tunnel, except this one finally features a different texture. After opening the metal panel at the end, they'll find themselves in a gloomy underground car park. The car park contains exactly one car and uses a line portal to just loop around on itself, so there's no point in exploring further. This car appears in several places throughout the game, although nobody is yet completely sure of its significance. Whichever way, the player can't interact with it here. Their only way forward is through the door besides the tunnel they emerged from, where they'll ascend an escalator and find themselves in a small regional airport. The airport has a few places to explore, but just two of them matter for our ongoing journey. First, we will unfortunately have to turn our attention to the bathrooms. The men's side is normal enough, but the women's side shows a warning of what's to come right from the start, once again using a line portal where you would expect a mirror to be to show a much less pristine copy of the bathroom. Once you cross this line at the right-hand side, the room will rapidly deteriorate into a blood-stained janitor's nightmare as you keep moving through it. This transformation is once again achieved by making several copies of the bathroom in various states of cleanliness and using silent teleports to move the player between them. In another example of this level's frankly psychotic attention to detail, there are 16 permutations of this one room, and the teleport lines are carefully arranged so that a shift never happens in the player's line of sight. There's actually a maze of sorts in the multitude of bathrooms. If the player moves around the room in a way that doesn't let the entrance out of their line of sight, they will be able to keep it clean while walking over lines that cause the rest of the room to deteriorate, and they will eventually be rewarded with the BFG, which will certainly come in useful later. However the player moves, once sufficient bloodiness has been achieved, the last teleport line will move the player to a copy of the bathroom inhabited by a party of red demons, which scares the hell out of me every time, even when I know it's coming. After the player has peeled themselves off the ceiling and survived the ambush, script 24, which has been looping around since the start of the level, finally gets a chance to act. Until now, there has been at least one object tagged 1393 on the map, so the script has just been looping around without doing anything. But now that these airport monsters, which are tagged 1393, are all dead, the if condition fails and the rest of the script is finally run. This will move a floor and ceiling aside to restore the door out of this copy of the bathroom and allow the player to exit. It will also change the portal mirror that we saw earlier to point to a clean mirrored copy of the bathroom instead. The player's route will take them over a bottle of pills on the way out the door. This is the 15th artifact. After the sequence has concluded, the bathroom will appear normal again and the encounter won't repeat due to the first teleport line not being marked as repeatable. Once the player has triggered it once, it performs no further action. Another detail is that the signs on the doors will now be switched. The player crossed over two lines that lowered the floor and ceiling of the two 3D floors making up the signs when they exited the bloodied bathroom. Our only route forward now is onto the plane seen waiting at gate 4. The plane is simply a cardboard set of mid-textures, and once again there's a portal across its door. This portal will take the player to the interior of the plane as it's in flight. Meticulously detailed though it is, there's very little to do on the plane. Pressing use on the cockpit controls will trigger an alarm along with a set of cloudy smoke monsters, and the player will then be able to jump out of the now open rear door. As they step out of the plane, the player enters a rather ingenious little area that acts as both a three-way filter and a timer to pause the action for a few seconds. Even though Doom's method of drawing the sky makes it look like the player has stepped into a wide open area, they're actually falling rapidly down a very narrow column, which you can see if I replace the sky with an actual texture. In fact, they're falling down one of three narrow columns because there's a set of line defs placed just as the player enters this area, which are set to teleport the player but have locks applied to them, so the place the player is moved to depends on the contents of the player's inventory. The first lines the player might cross have lock number 12 on them, which requires an object called the fire dummy key. This will be in the player's inventory if they've ever been in the burned house. The object is in the same spot that the player teleports into when they use the fuse box in the altered house. Normally it's set not to print any message, but you can see when it's picked up by altering the decorate definition. The second set of lines use lock number 103, which requires 8 items: the Pepsi, milkshake, ring, can of tuna, frisbee, Christmas bauble, milk bottle and baseball. These very disparate items are the ones that are shown in the picture frames in the right way round altered house, and it's only possible to have them at this point if you've taken the long way, visiting the strange secret alcove in the altered house, then the mirrored house, daycare and bathhouse. If the player doesn't have the fire dummy key or all 8 of these items, then they won't be teleported and will remain in the original sector. So the player is now in one of these columns and there will be a delay as the player falls through them. Eventually they'll hit the ground, and an actor hits floor object will run one of 3 scripts, 80, 81 or 82 depending on which sector they're in. Despite the script's length, the only difference between them is the first line in which the player is teleported. Each of them will move the player to a different place. The rest of the lines do some tidying up. The line that used to be a portal from the airport gate to the interior of the aeroplane will instead be pointed straight to the falling sky sectors. It looks like it's intended for the connection to go both ways, but a typo sets the way back to point to line tag 1927, which doesn't exist. However, the player never has any need to go back that way. The textures on lines tag 1988 will be blanked out, and thing 1991 will be deleted. This removes the texture of the plane from the airport, and the object that plays the ambient noise of the plane engines. A couple of sectors at the bottom of the boarding ramp will also be adjusted to make it look more like a door leading to nowhere. Now the ceiling of the sky columns will be changed to a black texture and the floor to grey 11. The ceiling is changed so that the walls of the columns no longer inherit the special sky flash from the ceiling above and will just be displayed as black if the player comes back here, making them fit with the now empty boarding gate. The reason for changing the floor is a little harder to track down, but the secret lies in myhouse's Z-script file. The definition for the class of the player object has had a condition added to its player landed make grunt sound function, disabling the hull check if the player is in a sector with floor grey 11. Therefore, the player won't make any noise when hitting the floor. The same thing applies to the vast spiral staircase in the House of Leaves labyrinth, where no sound will be played if the player falls onto the stairs or the deadly central floor from a height. That said, the floor in the aeroplane jump sectors is always grey 11, so the script makes no difference here. If the player had the fire dummy key, thus signalling that they came here via the burned house, their destination will be a version of the burned out house that's become decayed and overgrown. If they didn't have the fire dummy key but also didn't collect all 8 of the required items on the way here, they will instead find themselves in an empty house. The furniture has been removed and the built-in bookcases are empty. Neither of the houses have any new items or enemies to discover. The only thing to do in these places is to open the reappeared exterior doors and finally exit the house. If they then turn around, the player will find that the empty house or burnt house will have become the non-existent house, due to the presence of one last set of line portals which are one way, leading to a copy of the house with the house conspicuously missing. The only thing in the now empty lot is a sign for an estate agent called Navidson, and once again this is a name that appears in House of Leaves. There's now nothing left to do but go out of the gate and exit the level. The loop to and from underhalls is still present, encouraging the player to repeat the nightmare again. That's one way to end the level, but my house is far from finished with us yet. If the player has collected the 8 required artifacts, the arrangement after jumping out of the plane will return them to the altered house, and there's a clue to another route waiting for us there. We'll follow it in the next video. Thank you to everyone on the left here for supporting me creating Stumbling Tours videos. If you'd like to join in or make suggestions for other games to cover, please have a look at David X Newton on Patreon.